Okay, so we have built the outside perimeter and we've brought our form boards down to within 2 inches of the ground. Everything's staked, everything's kicked off, all the corners are nailed together, everything's dialed. Okay. If we're doing a perimeter foundation, our next step, in theory, is to put up the inside forms. Okay. But we don't want to do that quite yet. The next thing we want to do is put the rebar in. Okay. And then this would be the same thing if we're doing a slab. The next step would be to put the rebar in, regardless. Okay. The reason we want to do, and the reason is because we wouldn't have an inside form if we're doing a slab. Okay. But if we're doing a perimeter foundation and we've done the outside first, we don't want to put the inside form boards up yet because it's going to be really hard to reach into those forms and hang the rebar. Okay. We're going to have rebar, and we're going to talk more about this in the next lecture, but we're going to have rebar running all the way around the perimeter of our perimeter foundation. Okay, 3 inches down from the top, 3 inches up from the bottom, and no more than 18 inches between that. And that's the basic rebar amount. If that wall is retaining any dirt, if it gets above 4 feet from the bottom of the footing, then we're going to have vertical rebar. There's a lot of stuff that could potentially change, but suffice it to say, we want to get in and bend rebar, hang all the rebar before we put up that inside form. Okay, so we talked before about most of the time how we're going to do an 8-inch stem wall. Okay, what could change is if we're going taller. Again, if we're retaining something, if we're going to backfill against that wall, then maybe it's going to be thicker. Maybe our soil is of a really poor quality, and so we need to have a wider stem wall, something like that. Okay, but for the most part, it's just going to be 8 inches thick. Okay, potentially, after we've set that inside form and the entire perimeter of the form, perimeter foundation is formed up, we're probably going to need to put in some shutoffs. Okay, if we're doing a perimeter foundation, we need to allow for people to crawl under the foundation. The other name for it, after all, is a crawl space foundation. So when we talk about shutoffs, we've got an 8-inch wide stem wall. If we got some scrap lumber and ripped it down to 8 inches and slid that 8-inch wide piece of wood between the two forms and nailed into it through the forms, that would stop the flow of concrete there. Okay, picture our form boards, and then somebody just sets a hose inside the form boards and turns it on, and concrete starts coming out. Okay, it's going to flow all the way around. Okay, flow all the way around, and then it's going to hit that shutoff and it's going to stop. And then we're going to strip the forms off after the concrete gets hard, and we'll leave a little hole there. Okay, we'll do the same thing on, say for example, the big overhead garage door. We'll put shutoffs in to stop the flow of concrete there. If we have a stem wall and we have a garage door, we have a walk-through door, we want to put a shutoff in there also so that we don't have to step up to the stem wall height and then have a door and then step back down. Okay, we want the bottom of that door to be at the same height as the garage slab. So depending on the situation, that could change also. Okay. And by the way, my little analogy of putting a hose in the form and turning it on and concrete flowing out, it doesn't really work like that. It kind of works like that. We're going to watch a video of concrete being placed into the formwork with a concrete hose. All right, so when we get ready to set this inside form, we want the form to be 8 inches from the other form board. Okay, 8 inches away from the string line, and then that's going to give us an 8-inch concrete space. Okay, so when we're setting our stakes, we're going to set the stakes 9.5 inches butting the outside form. If we butt the outside form with our tape measure and measure back 9.5 inches, that's where we'll set our stake, because our form boards are 1.5 inches thick. So 9.5 minus 1.5 inches gives us 8 inches of concrete. okay? And we'll do the same trick. We will dangle a stake plumb, set it down, drive it in with our sledgehammer, leave it 2, 3, 4 inches high, okay? We don't have to do kickers on the outside, okay? Or excuse me, we're doing kickers on the outside. We're not going to do kickers on the inside, okay? We're going to have wedge ties and spreaders that prevent the forms from pulling apart or pushing over, okay? So as long as it's kicked on the outside, the wedge ties and spreaders will hold that inside form where it needs to go, okay? And so this is a wedge tie right here. It's this metal strap, okay? That's called the wedge tie. And then you put the wedges in these pre-punched slots in the wedge ties. Okay, so what usually happens when we're doing a crawl space foundation is I buy a couple boxes of wedge ties, and they're made by Simpson like everything else. And then the code is WT8, wedge tie 8 for an 8-inch wall. Okay, you can also get WT6s or WT10s, but WT8s are the most common. Okay, and so this isn't showing the other form board. So remember I said we want to leave a nail gap between the 2 rows of form boards so that we can come back, and then that allows us to slip this in, okay? We'll take our wedge tie. I'm going to get a prop here. We're going to take our wedge tie and we're going to drop it in, and then we're going to spin it in between the forms, okay? And then we're going to insert these wedges in there. And then when concrete is applying pressure to those forms, those wedges will prevent those form boards from pushing apart, okay? They're pretty fantastic as long as you put enough of them in, okay? There's a chart in the Simpson book that shows you how far apart to place these wedge ties. And they get, I think at the top you can get away with putting them every 42 inches or something like that. But the further down you go, okay, and the bigger your stem wall is, the further down you go, those wedge ties need to be placed more closely together because there's more weight pushing down at the bottom of those forms. And I've been on concrete pours before where we're using the vibrator. Maybe the concrete's a little too wet. Maybe the formwork was a little poor. And the biggest problem was we didn't have enough wedge ties in. And I can remember somebody vibrating the concrete, and I remember hearing this pop, pop, pop sound. And I was like, what in the heck is that? And I looked back, and the concrete was actually pushing the form so much that it was breaking. It was blowing out the wedge tie and shooting the wedges out, okay? So we want to make sure that we have enough of those in, okay? So these are called wedge ties. And then at the top, you can see in this picture, these are spreaders. We're going to put spreaders on the tops of the forms, okay? And here is a little trick. We're going to gather up all of our plywood scraps from cabinet making, and we're going to rip them to, I don't know, 2, 3 inches wide, and then we're going to cross cut all of them so that the spreaders are 11 inches long, okay? 11 inches is the magic number because we've got an 8-inch stem wall plus an 1.5 inch form brings us up to 9.5, plus another 1.5 inch form brings us up to 11, okay? So if we take our spreader and we nail it flush with the outside form, which has already been kicked off, it's already all dialed in and perfect on the string, nail it on that outside form, then we can just push away on the inside form or pull it in so that that inside form is flush with our spreader and nail it. And then that will hold that form board in place at the top, okay? When we get to our inside corners of the forms, we can't use duplex nails because the head will stick out into the concrete. And then when we strip the forms, then it'll blow the concrete out, okay? It'll not look very nice, okay? We want to use 16 sinkers and nail them all the way flush so the head is concealed, okay? We can't get in there and pull the nail out anyway because that's all going to be concrete. So we'll just kind of tear the form, we'll just pry the board apart and it'll pull out from the nails, and then we'll be able to pound the nails back through, okay? Everywhere, I don't really see it here, but everywhere we have a seam on our formwork, if we have more than a 20-foot board, we're going to get some plywood gussets. Again, we're going to dig through the cabinet making scrap pile and get a bunch of 3/4 inch plywood. And we're just going to nail 3/4 inch plywood on the outside face of those form boards. And that's going to tie those two form boards together. All right, here is a little video that we're going to watch, and it is kind of a start to finish, quickly though, concrete pour. Okay, they skip a lot of stuff, but from like scraping the lot to pouring concrete.
Here's our job site. We're just getting going to down layout. Jesse's making sure we're knocking any of the little vegetation off. Then I got to scrape it with a bucket to clean it up.
Okay, so they scrapped their lot. We're going to scrape our lot, but we want to scrape off all of the grass and brush and stuff.
So
like
here
that.
we are. We're forming now. This took us a couple of days to form 2 men. Obviously, we've done it before. 2x8 forms, 1x2 vertical uprights. We use screws to put everything together. That way it comes apart easy. And if you need to adjust something, you can unscrew a board and reset it. So here we go.
I don't like using screws.
Okay, a few little shots here. You notice that we've wrapped foil around the top.
I don't like using screws when forming. It seems like every time the heads get filled full of concrete, and then you can't undo the screws. Okay, so I think it's a big pain. And then one thing that we kind of missed, because I was talking over this guy, but they made little aluminum caps for all the anchor bolts, and then the pump guy told me about this a couple years ago, and it was great because then you don't get a bunch of concrete splattered on your anchor bolts, and then you have to clean the anchor bolts off, and you can't get the nuts on, and you might not know what I'm talking about yet, but it's a really good idea.
Notice we cut all our tops of our stakes off. One reason I like wooden stakes as opposed to the steel stake sticking up here. There's nothing in your way when you go to rod this thing off.
And I don't really like using wood stakes. They split and they break and they crack, and they're really hard to pull, and you're not supposed to leave them in the concrete. You're supposed to pull all the stakes out of the concrete. Okay. Some people like wooden stakes. I just think they're kind of a big waste. I like to buy metal stakes, and then you can reuse them forever, essentially. But wood stakes, they're kind of a one-time use thing, and then they just kind of get thrown in the garbage.
So we're going to pump this hole, probably about 35 yards of concrete. Here we go. Notice all the kickers too, these diagonal kickers here, probably about every 4 feet, keeps that form from moving around. Remember, when you're pouring concrete, you're shoveling tens of 1,000 pounds of sloppy wet concrete. It just wants to push and blow and move everything out of its way. So here we're pumping concrete here. And that's when we first pump, all we want to do is top off the footings there. Then we'll come back, wet the mud up a little bit, come back and fill these forms up. All topped off here. Now.
Okay, so one thing that guy was talking about that you might have missed, they did that pour in 2 separate stages. So they filled the footings first, and then they came back and topped it off a second pass. Okay, couple of reasons. A lot of people put the footings in drier so that it sets up a little faster. Okay, and then they'll wet up the concrete sometimes and pour that second layer on top of that. Okay, and that makes it so you don't have as many voids. Okay, and the other reason you want to do that, you don't want to fill everything all at once because it's way too much weight on the forms, and you might end up with a blowout. And what a blowout is when the forms break apart and concrete starts flowing out everywhere. Okay, and that's officially a nightmare when that happens. Okay, and then you're like scrambling to find a piece of equipment to back up to it to try and straighten the form out, or maybe you're like driving some shutoffs in and trying to come back later and fix it. It's kind of a huge nightmare. So we always want to try and avoid that.
Wet the concrete up a little bit, start filling these puppies up. We like to wet it up a little bit because then it fills up nice without any voids. The whole idea is when we strip all these forms, you don't want a whole bunch of voids. We want it all nice and clean and pretty. So that's the plan here. So here's Emilio pumping away. My boys are going to be behind us.
So yeah, it's written up there, but this is a vibrator, and you plunge the vibrator into the concrete, and it consolidates the concrete, and sometimes there's air pockets in there, and it relieves those air pockets, and it makes it so that when you pull the form boards, it not only looks really nice, but if you don't vibrate the concrete, you could have some structural failure because the concrete hasn't consolidated enough. And then there's pockets, and water can get in and rust the rebar out, and there could be problems like that.
Coming out our form ties, I saved those to reuse them. You notice just a smart idea. Look.
Okay, so here's the end of the wedge tie sticking out, and he's going around and popping the wedges out. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense, and then we'll do it in the carpentry class also. But those wedge ties are between the rows of form boards, and then there's a wedge that goes in between, and that prevents those forms from pushing apart, as long as you put them in tight enough.
Aluminum foil. Now I don't have a bolt. It's just caked in concrete. Those are all our anchor bolts. So again, now we're just going to go through and strip the forms and get ready to proceed with the construction. Okay, here's Justin continuing pulling all our spreaders, all our different things. We're going to keep stripping everything. In the old days, we put all this together with duplex nails, two-headed nail, but with the advent of decent screw guns in the last 10, 15 years, screws, we put this whole, there's not a nail in the whole system here. So we'll continue stripping through it, then we'll go along and inspect our foundation. A lot of times there's high areas along these boards. Ryan did a great job striking all this off. You can see it's pretty clean. So this is the time, the concrete's still relatively soft. You got a big high chunk of something come along with even the back of your hammer.
And so if you have a foundation that's not flat, you can come back and grind away the high spots and fill in the low spots. Okay, or grind away the high spots, and then you can always shim up underneath the mud sill. It's always a good idea to do that because, again, we want to start out with this thing being as flat and level as possible. Okay, because any little humps and bumps that are on that foundation are just going to translate up to the walls and then translate up to the roof.
Straighten it out. So here it is the next day. We've stripped the forms, walked the place. All the lumber's been restacked. Again, we will use that 2x8 as the floor for the raised floor section. The area to the left is the garage. We're going to form that in the next day, get that ready to pour, then we'll have at the floor. Again, we're really happy. No voids in here.
Okay, and so to kind of wrap up this video, that last thing he said, they'll use those form boards as the floor joists. Okay, and that's pretty common. A lot of people do that. I prefer to have dedicated form boards, and then I kind of like using engineered floor joists for the floor system. We'll talk about those later. But two different schools of thought. Some people like to use 2x6s or 2x8s for the forms, and then you strip them, and then you build the floor with it, and then you're done. And you're not hauling a bunch of form boards all over the world. Okay, different approaches. Okay.